Educators, it is Dr. Dickenson, and I'm going to be talking about Cal TPA Cycle 2, Designing Instruction and Assessment. So when you're working on your Cal TPA, you will have to provide evidence of both planning instruction, teaching assessment, reflection, and applying. And it begins with thinking about our state standards, those content standards, and creating measurable learning goals. We also have to consider who are our focus students and how we can provide support for our focus students in assessment measures as well as when we are teaching. Assessment consists of informal student self-assessment, formative, and summative. Now, a good way that I always remember how to differentiate between formative and summative is formative should inform my teaching, and summative should sum it up. So formative assessment happens while we're teaching. It can include things like asking students questions. And it can also include measures such as exit tickets or do nows. So anything I can look at that will help me think about my teaching and instruction. We also want to make sure that our design of instruction and assessment is based on universal design for learning strategies. That is those three principles of action and expression, representation, and engagement. UDL gives us the what, the why, and the how. So let's get started. Remember, when we start planning and designing instruction, we begin with those content standards. We have to unpack the standards to be able to identify what we want our students to be able to know, content knowledge, and be able to do, the skills. And once we've unpacked a standard, we can identify a learning outcome. This can also take place as a measurable outcome, such as 85% of the students will achieve mastery by this, by here and now. We can also identify an assessment to measure that students' knowledge and skills. That's why unpacking is so important, because we need to know what we're looking for. And so again, that relationship between what we're teaching and how we're assessing needs to be evident, especially for the Cal TPA. So educators, if you haven't seen my videos on how to unpack a standard, here's a quick overview. We start with the standard. We highlight the nouns, which are our content knowledge, what we want our students to be able to know. And then we identify the skills. Those are the verbs, the actions we want our students to be able to do. So I've done this here, and simply that's how we've unpacked a standard. So once you've unpacked a standard by identifying the content knowledge and the skills, then we can start taking some next steps for planning. We can take those three things, those three skills, 1, 2, 3, highlighted here, and we can include them in our planning. With each of those knowledge and skills, we want to be able to identify both a learning outcome and assessment. We should include both formative and summative assessment measures. That formative assessment measure is going to help me in real time. So while I'm teaching, I'm asking questions, I'm engaging students in activities that allow me to collect evidence and see, are we ready to go on? Or do I need to pause here and reteach? Also consider how you can include assessment measures that include technology. For Cal TPA Cycle 2, you will need to be able to demonstrate that your students can use technology both to create products of learning as well as to apply the skills that they're learning about vis-a-vis technology. So in this particular example, I've included examples of things that I'm going to use for assessment for my standard on rational numbers. I've included an example on using a Google Jamboard. I've included an example of students using a Flipgrid, which is a digital tool where students can orally respond and videotape themselves explaining their thinking. I've also included activities that would allow my students to engage in a digital technology skill. I love Desmos, but there's so many out there, and that will help you as well collect data as students are working through digital activities. All right, another piece that you want to consider when you're both designing instruction and considering assessment is who are you doing this for? Who is your audience? So for Cal TPA Cycle 2, you need to select 3 focus students from your class. And you will need to write a narrative about each of your focus students. Now, Cal TPA is very specific about who your focus student should be. Your focus student number 1 should be a district identified English learner. That means this English learner has been identified using a assessment tool such as the CELT or the LPAC. So you should be able to take note of their CELT and LPAC score and level. If you have a student that's been redesignated, you may also include them as your focus student number 1. You want to be able to tell a narrative about that student, why you've selected them. And again, if this focus student number 1 is an English learner, you want to think about the academic language demand of your content standard, and you'll want to consider how are you going to provide scaffold support for language demand. For focus student number 2, you should select a student who has either an IEP, which is an individualized education plan. So the student has been identified as having a learning difference and is getting both either accommodations or modifications, as well as IEP goals. You'll want to articulate that you've read that IEP, that you're aware of the student's specific learning disability, and you'll be able to articulate what supports are recommended for that particular student. You may also select a student who has a 504 plan and a student who is identified as gifted and talented. So you have 3 choices there for your focus student number 2. Again, just like focus student number 1, you're giving a narrative. You're talking about why you selected this student. You're including information from their family, their home life. Focus student number 3 is a student who may have either an additional academic or emotional need. So perhaps the student has experienced some type of trauma, whether it be divorce, loss of a parent, maybe they're homeless, they've experienced poverty, bullying, etc. So think of a student that you would select that would need some type of social emotional support. And again, you're going to write a narrative. You're going to tell us about this particular student that you selected, how they're performing both academically and their social emotional learning and growth goals, what support you've already provided, and how you're going to support them in both teaching and learning. All right, here's some tips and strategies about how you can find your 3 focus students. You can look at class reports. You can ask a site support provider, your master teacher, if you're student teaching. You can also consider informal interactions with that student. Be careful about questioning your students too much, but you want to make sure that you have some evidence to support why this is a focus student. I've also included some pretend students to just give you an idea of what this should look for. And by the way, I don't know if I've noticed this, but I am a Cal TPA assessor. So I've had some experiences reading Cal TPAs and evaluating them using these rubrics. All right, educators. So now that we've thought about who these focus students will be, now you will want to consider what types of support you will provide for your focus students. Looking at your students' profiles, you want to consider technology that you would include to match the needs of your students. So, for example, if your student has a speech and language IEP, what additional technology supports can you provide to support in language? Perhaps you're including sentence stems. Perhaps your student is an English language learner who does not speak any English? How can you provide technology resources, something like immersive reader that will translate English into their native language? So consider technology, and I'm going to share with you a list of technology resources, of course, and consider how you may present that material in a way that supports all learners. Remember, you're teaching standards. You don't want to necessarily water down that standard. You want to make sure that they have access to that standard. Then provide your students with flexibility to demonstrate mastery. So if your student has a specific learning disability and needs accommodations, perhaps they have a disability such as dysgraphia and they have a hard time writing print, you can provide a tool like Dragon Speech to Text where they can orally narrate that text and it can appear as print. Certainly, there are a ton of ideas. Check out UDL, check out the CAS network, consider accommodations that would provide your students with those supports they need to be successful. All right, I've been talking about Cal TPA, and specifically in Cycle 2, you need to be aware that one of the rubrics will ask you about how you are using education technology to meet the needs and support and engage all learners with content-specific learning. In fact, for Cal TPA Cycle 2, one of your video clips needs to show a learning segment in which students are using technology. So just be mindful of that. If you're already working on your Cal TPA Cycle 2 and you're creating evidence, you have to create a video clip where you're showing students using EdTech. So what does using EdTech mean? Well, there are a ton of technology tools. Some you may already be aware of. I'm actually using technology right now. I'm using Screencastify to record my screen. Certainly, this is something that your students could use to give a narrative presentation about a concept or to demonstrate a skill. There are many ideas out there. So check out my presentation on integrating technology, and you'll have access to a ton of digital tools at your digital fingertips. Now let's take a look at the Cal TPA Cycle 2 Education Rubric. There are 5 levels. Pie in the sky, we want to get to 3 or above. 3 is passing. So take a look at Rubric 2.4. Step 2, teach and assess with educational technology. Remember, this is an annotated video clip that you're submitting for your Cal TPA Cycle 2. There are a total of 4 annotated video clips that you're going to be including with your Cal TPA assessment. In order for you to get a passing grade of a level 3, you need to provide your students with an opportunity to use educational technology to achieve and or demonstrate the content-specific learning goal. Remember in my earlier example when I was showing you how I unpack a standard, I added that in the assessment. I was using digital tools like Flipgrid for students to record a narration and explain their thinking. I added another tool like Desmos for students to work on a digital activity. Now, in order to get a level 3, they want to see students using technology. If you want to try to reach for a level 4, then the keyword here is choice. Students are going to be able to choose the education technology that they want to select to achieve a demonstrated content-specific learning goal. So let's say perhaps you're a social studies teacher and you're teaching about Roman history. You may have your students create a digital presentation, perhaps using something like Google Slides. You may ask them to narrate. They may have another choice. Perhaps they're creating a podcast and doing an interview about one of the famous figures from that time period. Maybe they're creating a digital timeline. So the key here is choice. You always want to think about outside the box how you can provide your students with multiple means of expression. So think about different ways that you can provide your students with choice to show what they know. And then at level 5, students are so in the flow with using technology, they really don't need your guidance here. They're able to make choices independently. Perhaps they've been doing a digital poster like Canvas for quite some time, and they're able to use this digital tool independently. They're able to apply the content standards and include graphics and images and narration without much direction. That would be a good example of a level 5 for Cal TPA Cycle 2, Rubric 2.4. Now, think about level 1 and 2. We don't want to not provide our students with opportunities to use or access. They're just watching technology. That would definitely be a level 1. In level 2, they may be able to use we are using the educational technology, but it's presented in a one-to-many learning environment to either drill or practice. So maybe they're just going on to Khan Academy and they're working through an activity and they're just practicing. So when we start thinking about preparing for challenging tasks that integrate technology, what level of rubric do you think each of these activities match? In the first example, as shown here, the teacher is showing a video presentation. The students are watching a video on how to solve a volleyball. That's it. It doesn't say much about them actually demonstrating after they watch the video. So if I was to grade that, I would say most likely it is a level 1. The candidate is just showing the students a video. The students are not provided with an opportunity to actually access the educational technology or to demonstrate their learning. In the second example, the candidate is presenting a game of Kahoots on the smartboard. The content of the questions are multiple choice, and students are using their own laptop to answer the online questions with correct responses, earning points for their team. The class can see the responses, but they only know which team responded, not individual students. So we see a higher level of engagement here in which the students are able to use the technology, but it feels more like a drill or practice than actually engaging in the activity to achieve or demonstrate a content-specific learning goal. So here, I would say this is a level 2. Certainly, you can modify both of these examples. Instead of just having the students watch a video, perhaps you can extend it so that after they watch the video, then they're doing a Flipgrid video of their own and demonstrating the skill. That would certainly move up on the rubric to a level 3. And similarly, rather than playing the game of Kahoot, they're creating their own questions. They're actually engaging in using the technology. That might also be an example of a level 4, with students engaging and creating. Here are some additional examples of ways that you can engage in challenging Cal TPA tasks with technology. Students could work on a group project web quest. They could be provided with a template and example, and they'll collaborate with group members to create a digital fitness plan for a fictional client. Now, that's really thinking outside the box. In the next example, students are creating their own Kahoot. They're placed in groups and they're going to create 5 questions. Later, the students are going to play the Kahoot games in the class. Another great way for students to actually engage with the technology, and use it. Think about Bloom's taxonomy. We're moving on from the level of understanding to application and creation. So, certainly, those two examples are great ways that you can actually have your students use the technology. There's not too much choice here. So, certainly, that would be a level 3. And if you were to provide your students with more choices in terms of digital tools, then you could also reach a level 4. All right, now that we've talked about ways that you can prepare your students for more challenging tasks with the Cal TPA and with technology, think about some additional resources that you can use to engage your kiddos. There are digital resources such as making a hyperdoc and including all of these wonderful tools that are at our digital fingertips. They're all free. If you haven't checked out things like Quizzy, Kahoot, Quizlet, or Flipgrid, these are commonly used across content areas. And I love tools like Adobe Spark, where kids can make digital posters and they can narrate with images. So, all of these ways help build our students and give them ways to express what they know, products of learning. So, when you think about what you want to include, try to think about who your learners are, what supports they need, ways that you can integrate visual and digital tools that allow your students to demonstrate understanding and provide built in scaffolds. So, if you're using a digital tool, have them also have access to things like Google Translate, where they can get um, access to their primary language and translation. All right, educators. Well, I hope you're feeling more confident with thinking about the Cal TPA. And now I want you to also do some self reflection, which is an important part of taking and doing an assessment. Have yourself watch a video and consider how you're going to provide accommodations for your students when you're both designing assessments and developing instruction.